So Mage is arguably the best class in the game right now. Hopefully they can get some cards to develop an archetype that doesn't involve sitting behind Ice Block and trying to draw Pyroblast. We start with Cold Wraith. This is a 3-mana 3/4, so you don't really feel bad playing it on curve. And if you get the card draw, this card is nuts. I actually think this card is pretty sick. It's not super easy to freeze an enemy minion, but you've got Frostbolt, we've got Breath of Sindragosa now, which, spoiler alert, I think is a pretty good card. I think if you're playing a Tempo Mage with just like 2 Frostbolts and 2 Breath of Sindragosa, maybe that's even enough to justify this Cold Wraith. You obviously want to draw a card out of this some percentage of the time, but as a 3-mana 3/4, if you're playing this in a Tempo or an aggressive deck, you're really not that upset just slamming this on curve. And you're also probably playing Water Elementals in that deck. The Frostlich Jaina deck this card makes a lot of sense in, because obviously Jaina's summoning Water Elementals, and you're probably playing Frostbolts and maybe even Water Elemental, maybe Blizzard, maybe Frost Nova in that deck anyway. I could even see this card being played in Freeze Mage. It's a deck that really values card draw. It obviously has freeze effects with Frostbolts, Blizzard, Frost Nova. Maybe this card is even good enough for Kona Cold to see play. And modern iterations of Freeze Mage even play like Mana Worm into Arcanologist curves, so they actually have early games where you wouldn't mind just tempoing this out on 3. The card seems super strong if you can ever get it to work, and there are at least 3 different Mage archetypes where this card has a shot at working, so I would actually be pretty surprised if this card did not end up seeing play. Frozen Clone. So you spend 3 mana on this, your opponent summons a Southsea Deckhand and you feel bad. They summon a Firefly and you feel bad. Even if they summon like a Vicious Fledgling, you feel pretty bad. Like, it's good in control mirrors, where you can copy some high value thing. Maybe if they're afraid of Mirror Entity or Potion of Polymorph, they play some like mid-rangey Battlecry thing. But then you still have to like spend mana playing those. You already sunk 3 mana into your Frozen Clone. How often are control mirrors ever a thing in 2017? Mage has plenty of ways to get value through the Death Knight or Sindragosa or Kabbalist Tome or any of that kind of stuff. Just seems super underwhelming to me. It's not a terrible card, but like, where do you ever want to play this? You have to spend 3 mana on it. You're not playing this in a Kirin Tor Mage deck. It does give rise to a pretty spicy meme though. So if Control becomes really, really popular, then maybe Quest Rogue becomes a thing again, even in its nerfed state. So you go turn 1 Cabal Lackey and play Mana Bind. And for some reason they don't use the coin to check for counterspell, they just play their Caverns Below. So then you get their Caverns Below from your Mana Bind. And then you play Frozen Clone, and they play their Firefly or whatever. You get 2 copies of the Firefly in your hand, you're already playing Firefly, because you're trying to snipe Quest Rogue, and then that's how you complete the quest before them. If anyone can pull that off, they have my respect. I don't really see a real application for Frozen Clone though. Breath of Sindragosa, so I think this card is actually pretty good. If you're playing a Tempo Mage deck with Mana Worm, this is a pretty solid follow-up to Mana Worm on its own. And it's actually disgustingly good with Sorcerer's Apprentice. That early in the game, the 2 damage is fairly likely to kill whatever you hit. And if you don't kill it, you just get to freeze it. And even if you hit the wrong one, like your Mana Worm or your Babbling Book or whatever can help clean up the other thing, or you can use that to target down the specific thing you want to kill. And in the mid-game, you can use this to just like lock down a Bittertide Hydra, or some Lifesteal minion that your opponent's playing or something if you're an aggressive deck. A lot of people thought Arcane Blast wouldn't see play. As a 1-mana deal 2 damage card, they felt it just didn't do enough and ended up being pretty good. Of course, people played Azure Drake to go along with it, but instead of the spell damage bonus, this thing freezes the thing, and freeze probably scales better into the late game than a spell damage bonus, at least if you're trying to play a deck that just kills the opponent to death. I just think the potential of snowballing with this and a Sorcerer's Apprentice is actually just completely disgusting. I wouldn't be surprised if this card, basically on its own, but maybe with like Cold Wraith or something like that, ended up making Tempo Mage a thing, or maybe if Secret Mage just ended up making Sorcerer's Apprentice plus this card staple in their lists. I think a lot of them already play Sorcerer's Apprentice. It just seems to me like the potential tempo gain off this card, especially combined with Sorcerer's Apprentice, but even on its own, is just pretty nuts in the early game, especially for a deck that already has the best 1-drop in the game. Ghastly Conjurer. So this is another seemingly pretty strong mage card. So the first thing that comes to mind with add a mirror image to your hand is Quest Mage. One of the problems with Quest Mage is you just kind of have a hard time getting spells from outside your deck. Of course, you have Primordial Glyph and Babbling Book and Kabbalah Stone, but Kabbalah Stone's kind of clunky, Babbling Book's kind of bad, and if you're going into anything deeper than that, the cards just become really trash. This card has a pretty solid body, it fights well on its own, and against aggro, playing out 0-2 taunts if those like block Arcanite Reaper hits, that's really strong. You can even play this in a more aggressive deck, and the mirror images can protect your Sorcerer's Apprentice or your Mana Worm or something. Just makes your board even harder to deal with. If you're playing this in a Secret Mage, you're probably playing counterspell, so you don't really have to worry too much about AoE if you're just committing your 0-2 taunts to the board. At first I thought this compares pretty closely to a Water Elemental, and a lot of Mage decks don't even play Water Elemental. But the more I think about it, I think a lot of times the mirror images are going to be at least as good as Water Elemental. Mirror Image is one of those cards that's never really worth putting in your deck, although it has seen some competitive play. But it's not really worth putting in your deck most of the time, but if you can get it for free, it's a card that can really save your ass. So I actually think this card is pretty impressive, even potentially in a few different Mage decks. Ice Walker is a 2-mana 1/3, so that's kind of a bummer. Your hero power also freezes the target. That can be pretty nice in the late game if you're just trying to lock down a big minion, you don't really have the removal, so you can just freeze it in place. It's also got some synergy for like Cold Wraith and Shatter, and God forbid Cryomancer is in your deck. I don't think this is really the card that makes Shatter playable, but if for some reason you already have a Shatter in your deck, you could play this, I guess. This might also be the companion that Demented Frostcaller needed to make the world's most annoying Mage deck. You just constantly freeze all of their things. You still have to try to figure out how to win the game past that point. I guess you just do Mage things and fireball them in the face or something. Seems like just playing Frost Nova or whatever is probably more efficient in that situation, but it could have some use. The problem with this card is it's not good on turn 2, and in the late game you're probably never going to get more than one hit out of this. So it seems like it's like a turn 8 one-time freeze one of their dudes for 2 mana or something. Just seems pretty underwhelming. But God, this card is going to be annoying if it's good. Doomed Apprentice, opponent's spells cost 1 more. The thing is, if you're trying to shut down Miracle Rogue with this, and their backstab costs 1 more, they still pay 1 mana for their backstab, kill this, and then they miracle. Like, this card is already overcosted by 1, so if they're paying 1 extra mana to kill your should be a 2-drop, it kind of evens out. And the 1 mana hit to them is not that significant. If we end up with a combo deck that involves spells and needs exactly 10 mana to finish the game for their combo turn, this card can kinda lock it out. But overall, I think as a 3 mana 3/2, it really just doesn't have enough stats. You feel really bad playing this card on curve, and even against that fabled combo deck, it's pretty hard to figure out what turn you want to play it. Just seems really underwhelming as a 3 mana 3/2. I believe this card is called Simulacrum. Don't hold me to it though. 3 mana, copy the lowest cost minion in your hand. So the first thing that comes to mind with this is like Arcane Giant. If your Arcane Giants cost 0, this is like 3 mana for another 8/8. That's kinda cool, I guess. You can also use this in Quest Mage as like a second Molten Reflection, but I'm not sure that's really the piece of consistency that Quest Mage needs. And if you're playing this in Quest Mage, you have to make sure that all your draw cards and your Doomsayers and whatnot are out of your hand before you can even copy your Sorcerer's Apprentices. But if Quest Mage becomes good and people start teching Dirty Rat to beat it, I can see this card coming into lists to help with the Dirty Rat matchups. You still get wrecked if they pull your Antonidas though, but you can survive if they pull a Sorcerer's Apprentice. You can also play this in a control list, and like in a control mirror try to get a second copy of a relevant card in that matchup, but generally cards that are flexible in that way, where you can either copy a big card or make it a small card or something, those are only really good if they're good at both the top and the low end. In Simulacrum, you can't really play this against aggro and like copy a 2-drop and play that 2-drop because you spent 5 mana for it. It's not really similar to say like a Forbidden Flame or something, where you can play it on the cheap against aggro or hold it for good value against a more controlling deck. So even though it has its flexibility, I feel like you pay a lot for that flexibility. And even in the control mage decks, you're still playing maybe like a Babbling Book or something, and you'd still have to get that out of your hand, which wouldn't be that hard really, but it could be kind of awkward to set this up the way you want it. It just seems like it's going to be kind of hard for this to find a home outside of a combo deck. and I'm not sure that even in those combo decks this is really what they need. Glacial Mysteries, Mysterious Challenger with 0 stats and 2 more mana cost. Mage Secrets are better than Paladin Secrets, but man, you're paying a lot to get those out. The problem with this card is you kinda need to make sure you get, we'll say, at least 4 secrets out of this for it to really be value. And to guarantee that you're gonna have that many secrets left in your deck on turn 8, you're gonna need to be playing a lot of secrets. Secret Mage is kind of a thing already, but at most they play like 5 total secrets, 3 different ones. I don't think they're really willing to commit that many more deck slots to secrets, because the games where you draw the secrets instead of your Glacial Mysteries, you're just going to lose because you have a bunch of bad cards in your hand. And if you pull like Frozen Clone, Mirror Entity, and Potion of Polymorph, your opponent just plays some garbage 1-drop and they've dealt with 3 of your secrets already. So it's not really like Paladin, where when you pull 5 secrets, all those secrets have some kind of synergy together. Like back in the day you killed their thing and Noble Sacrifice blocked it, and then Avenge buffed a thing. But if you tried to leave all their things up, then Competitive Spirit buffed all their things. Mage doesn't really have that kind of synergy. In fact, the whole Mirror Entity, Ocean of Polymorph thing is actually kind of the opposite of that. So with the current secret pool, it seems really, really unlikely that I would ever want to play this card. But if you're playing some kind of combo mage deck that anticipates drawing its whole deck all the way to Fatigue, this card can kind of be like 8 mana draw 5 cards, in terms of just digging through your deck efficiently. You get your Ice Block up, you can pull a counter spell. Maybe there's a deck for this somewhere, but certainly not any current mage decks would play this card. I just think putting that many secrets into your deck, enough to support this, is just too much. Syndragosa. So she summons 2 0/1 frozen champions, and when those die, they add random legendaries to your hand. The thing is, random legendaries really aren't that good on average. We're getting the 3 garbage prince cards in this set. There's like Lorewalker Cho and Nat Pagel. Of course you have bombs. The dream is probably you get another Syndragosa, or like a Lich King or something crazy like that. But on average you're probably going to get 1 good legendary, 1 bad legendary. And it's definitely pretty slow. In Mage you can hero power your own frozen champions, but if you're hero powering your own stuff, a lot of times that's not great. Although it does have pretty good synergy with Frostlich Jaina. This is notably a dragon, so maybe you want to play Syndragosa with like a Bookworm and some Netherspite Historians and some Twilight Drakes, and you can play Dragon Control Mage. This is the only Mage Dragon, so Netherspite Historian is going to discover other Syndragosas a lot in that deck, which can end up with a ton of value. Maybe you can play a Dragon Mage with the Death Knight, 1 Syndragosa, and like no other late game cards, because you can just keep getting Syndragosas into legendaries, hopefully. Could be a pretty fun deck. The value of this card is definitely there for 8 mana. 8 mana 8/8 is pretty solid. And if you actually get the value out of the Battle Cry, it's pretty good, but this card is really slow. So if there's a metagame where it's slow enough that you can afford to play this card, it's probably pretty good. If there's a lot of aggro, this is a dead card. Even in the control metas, this card does have a lot of competition. You could be playing like an Old God or a Lich King or a Ysera or something. The value for this card is there though, and I think the synergy with Frostlich Jaina might be enough for this to see play, and I'm kind of hoping that this helps make Dragon Mage kind of a thing. So Frostlich Jaina, I think this card is like really strong. I was tempted to even call her a 5-star card, but not quite there, I don't think. So you immediately get the value of the Water Elemental, you immediately heal for 5, and you're probably trying to play this when you already have elementals on the board. So even if you're kind of weak, you get the 5 armor, and the elementals you already have on the board get lifesteal, so you can trade those in and heal up even more. So just the turn you play this, it's actually a pretty solid defensive option. And then the turn after that, since this costs 9 mana, you're not going to get to use the hero power the turn of most of the time. The turn after that, you get a pretty crazy hero power. It maintains the identity of Fire Blast in that you deal 1 damage, but if you kill a thing, you get to summon a Water Elemental, and Water Elemental is pretty damn good, especially when you consider that all of those Water Elementals have lifesteal. So it's actually kind of similar to Jiraxxus. It costs 9 mana, it does some stuff to your health the turn you play it, but unlike Jiraxxus, your hero power can directly help deal with the board. I guess that's kind of what Jiraxxus uses his weapon for. But you get an immediate Water Elemental the turn you play it. This card has a lot more sustain than Jiraxxus, and I think it's actually somewhat arguable that a Water Elemental is about as good as a 6/6. One of the problems with defensive mage decks is they had a hard time just not dying. But this thing gives your elementals lifesteal, it gives you immediate armor. This card is really good for living into the late game. And if you can use this hero power properly, it's an immense amount of value, as well as not being able to die because you have so much healing. So I think Frostlich Jaina is pretty damn strong. I don't think you even really need to be playing an elemental mage deck. Just maybe a water elemental or two is already in your deck. Maybe you play like a Tar Creep or something. You just have like a couple elementals in your deck. You don't need to go full in on this energy. And then the water elementals you get from your hero power are enough that the lifesteal component of the card is still relevant. She seems super strong. I think Frostlich Jaina is probably somewhere in the top 3 of the Death Knights in the set. Seems like she could be good enough for a new mage archetype. I don't think she really slots into any existing decks, but I think it's pretty easy to imagine a deck where she would work. Maybe even something like a Kazakus and Solia mage deck. This would probably be a very good finisher in that kind of deck. Mage actually got a lot of interesting cards, and the best thing is most of them don't just slot into the current Ice Block and Draw Firelands Portal decks. I think Frostlich Jaina is definitely the standout here. Maybe I'm even being a little bit conservative calling her a 4-star instead of a 5-star. But Cindergosa is pretty interesting, and I think Cold Wraith, Breath of Cindergosa, and Ghastly Conjurer are all just very strong cards. I think I am giving a higher rating to Cold Wraith and Breath of Cindergosa than most people, so I definitely could be wrong on those. But it really seems pretty easy for me to imagine a world where those end up in a lot of mage decks. I think Mage definitely got some cool new toys in this expansion. Looking forward to playing some Mage. So Paladin went from being pretty much unplayable in Mean Streets of Gadgetzan to being one of the dominant classes in Journey to Un'Goro. So it'll be kind of interesting to see where they end up in the Knights of the Frozen Throne. Luckily, they didn't seem to get any Murloc cards, which I'm quite happy about because I do not enjoy playing against Murloc Paladin. First up we have Chillblade Champion. 4 mana 3/2 charge lifesteal. I'm still not entirely sure how good lifesteal is, particularly in a class like Paladin, which already has a lot of healing. They have access to Forbidden Healing for huge heals, Rag Light Lord, True Silver Champion for small heals. But the ability for this to trade into something and heal you for 3, or you can just go face, heal for 3, and if the opponent has to kill you, it heals again. Seems like it has a pretty good amount of value. On its own, I think it's a pretty reasonable card. It also seems like it would be a pretty good card if you hand buffed it with things like Smuggler's Run or, Grime Street Outfitter, those kinds of cards. Because on a minion with lifesteal, the +1/+1 is worth a little bit more than +1/+1. So this seems like it would be one of the better hand buff targets. And I was definitely tempted to call this card bad. I'm still a little tempted to call it bad. But spoiler alert, I think Blackguard is a pretty good card, and this card works pretty well with Blackguard in theory. So that was kind of one of the reasons that pushed me into saying it's probably a pretty okay card. I could definitely see it seeing some amount of play. One issue with it is, if you're just charging into a minion and trading it off, it does compete with True Silver Champion, which is certainly kind of a bummer. But this can also be used in the same turn as another weapon. Maybe you curve Rallying Blade into this, or maybe you already have a True Silver Champion on the board. Maybe you have a 5/3 lifesteal weapon already on the board. Paladin is a class that can get a little bit weapon clogged. So if you're just putting this in a normal Paladin deck that doesn't really have too many synergies, you're probably better off with True Silver Champion. But if you're also playing it alongside hand buffs or a bunch of weapons or maybe Blackguard, I think this card definitely has some merit. Righteous Protector. So it's Argent Squire, but also has Taunt. Argent Squire is a pretty good card, so this must be a pretty good card. You can also just play 2 of these and 2 Argent Squires, and the redundancy between those makes buff cards quite a bit better. This is also another good 1-drop for small-time recruits. Not sure if that's really a thing, but who knows, maybe it could be. There's a small amount of Divine Shield synergy in the set, which might be relevant with this card, but even if there's not, this is just such a solid 1-drop, particularly for an aggro deck. I've also seen people saying this is a nerf to Stonehill Defender, but even in late game, this card scales pretty well for a 1-drop. It's a 1-drop you can play in the late game. It only has 1 health, but if they ping off the Divine Shield, it's still a 1/1 taunt that they have to get through. The card is super good on turn 1 and pretty annoying every turn after that. It probably is overall a nerf to Stonehill Defender because this card is no Tyrion, it's no Tarim. But even in the case of Stonehill Defender, I think this is a pretty solid option. I think this is probably going to end up being one of the better cards in the set. unless for some reason Paladin's not viable or the only good Paladin decks don't want to play 1-drops. But with a 1-drop this good, that seems a little bit unlikely. Also somewhat noteworthy, since this is so good for buffs, it's a slight buff to Galvadon Paladin. Maybe that's a thing. Card is sick though. Dark Conviction, so it's like Keeper of Uldamon, but not on a stick. Keeper of Uldamon was really strong because you could use it to snowball your board a little bit, you could use it to deal with one of their threats. The Keeper of Uldamon itself was a 3/4, so if you set something on their side of the board to a 3/3, the Keeper of Uldamon is going to beat it in combat. As far as just using Dark Conviction as like a removal spell, kind of like Keeper of Uldamon, obviously this doesn't have the 3/4 body that lines up well against it, and just as a 2 mana, probably deal like 2 damage to the opponent's minion a lot of times. It's not a very efficient removal spell, but where I think this card really shines is in an aggro deck. If you play a 1-drop on turn 1 and follow it up with Dark Conviction, that seems like a pretty solid curve, especially when you consider that aggro Paladin is probably going to be playing 2 Argent Squires and 2 Righteous Protectors. So on turn 2 you have a 3/3 Divine Shield a lot of the time. And even if they popped your bubble, you still get to buff your guy up to a 3/3, so I don't think this card is very good outside of an aggro Paladin, but in aggro Paladin with 4 Argent Squires, this card seems like it could be really strong. And even though most of the time you're probably going to be using this to buff one of your dudes in that deck, it is kinda nice that late game it can double as removal, especially on like a big taunt minion or something. Also, Galvadon Paladin, kind of a thing. This card should count. Howling Commander. So it's a 3-mana 2/2. A lot of times if you're playing Divine Shields, you kind of want it to be in an aggressive deck, but in an aggressive deck you can't really afford to play a 3-mana 2/2, so I don't think this card really fits in a deck like that. If you're playing a mid-range or a control deck, you can use this to draw Tyrion, which is kind of what everyone thinks of, I think, when they first see this card. But if you're playing this on turn 3 to draw Tyrion, you're drawing an 8-drop that you still can't play for 5 more turns. If you want to play this in the late game, this is 3 mana and Tyrion's 8, that's 11, so you can't even make a full turn out of that, it's a little bit awkward. Maybe if Bolvar Fireblood ends up seeing play, this card is a little bit better. It also works well with Wickerflame Burn Bristle. But I'm not sure I really care to play a 3-mana 2/2 draw Wickerflame Burn Bristle. Maybe this will end up being good in a mid-range Paladin that plays exactly Wickerflame, Bolvar, and Tyrion. But I think any more Divine Shield cards than that, and you're kind of decreasing the value of this Battlecry by quite a bit. And actually, even in the deck like that, I think a lot of times you're still going to be playing Righteous Protector, and I don't think you really want to draw Righteous Protector with this card. I don't know, I could really see it going either way. There's some really sick cards you can get off this, but it's also a 3-mana 2/2, and sometimes the card it draws isn't going to be that good. Desperate Stand. It's Ancestral Spirit, but worse. So I'm really tempted to just straight up call this card garbage, since it's worse than Ancestral Spirit, which already isn't that great of a card. But it is in Paladin, so it does have different synergies. It's also similar to Redemption, but for 1 more mana. The benefit of this card over Redemption, of course, is you could choose the minion that gets redeemed, and also you can use this to trade off during your turn. Redemption is a secret, so it doesn't trigger during your turn, obviously. So I guess the dream is you trade off your Tyrion, and then you resummon a Tyrion, I guess. But then it's only got 1 health, it's pretty easy to kill. You're probably only getting 4 total Ashbringer charges instead of the normal 3. Really doesn't seem like that much value to me. You can play it on little shitter Divine Shield dudes, but that doesn't really seem worth a card slot in my opinion. Could be pretty sick on Wickerflame Burn Bristle on turn 5 against an aggro deck, but I think there's a pretty good chance you can find a better play than that. I don't know. Like, Ancestral Spirit might be better in Paladin than in Shaman, but I don't think it's enough better that I want my minion to have 1 health. There are definitely some synergies, I just don't really feel any of them are strong enough for this to see play. I guess you can also play this in a N'Zoth deck, copy your Karen, then when you play N'Zoth you can get 2 Karens back. Cool, I guess. Maybe the dream is you somehow go through 6 Tyrions in a game and res all those off N'Zoth. Cool, but again you're still running into the multiple Ashbringer problem. I don't know, I'm really underwhelmed by this card. Arrogant Crusader. Well, it's a 4 mana 5/2. That's an aggressive stat line for a 4-drop. If it's your opponent's turn, you get to summon a 2/2 ghoul when it dies. So it's pretty good against AoE, it has a lot of power, so your opponent is going to want to deal with it eventually. Even if you're playing a very aggressive deck, you usually do want the option to be trading. And the fact that this guy just goes 1 for 1 with Tar Creeper, doesn't even get his Death Rattle, I think is kind of a disappointment. In some sense, you kind of want to look at it and be like, well, it's anti-AoE. If you play this and they consecrate it, you get a 2-2 left over. But if you just played Lost Tall Strider, you'd have a 5-2 left over instead of a 2-2. I guess it is better against Flame Strike than Lost Tall Strider, but that's pretty far off curve. In general, I think this whole, if it's your opponent's turn, summon a thing, death rattle effect is pretty underwhelming. Not a very valuable mechanic to have on a card when you give up so many stats for it. Basically, I think this card sucks. It's no piloted shredder because you can't trade with it. Light Sorrow is a 4-mana 1/4 weapon. That is really disappointing. I think you need to have at least 2 friendly minions lose Divine Shield for this to be valuable. In that case, it's like a 4-mana Assassin's Blade. But Paladin already has a really solid 4-mana weapon. They have a pretty good 3-mana weapon also. They're probably playing Tyrion. They might even be playing their new Death Knight card. So Paladin has a lot of weapons. Is this better than any of them? Probably not. It's unlikely to be very good the turn you play it unless you can somehow also trade off 2 of your own Divine Shields. But that's going to be pretty hard to orchestrate, especially on curve. I think Paladin just has better weapons. It's too hard to buff this to make it relevant. There is the dream where you have 6 Divine Shields on the board, and then you play your Blood Knight and it gets +18/+18. And then this thing is a 7/4 weapon, and that's kinda sick, I guess. I don't know. Usually when I'm playing a weapon on turn 4, I want it to actually be able to kill something on turn 4, and this usually doesn't do that, so I think this card kinda sucks. So we've got Blackguard. Whenever your hero is healed, do that much damage to a random enemy minion. So the thing I like about this card is it costs 6 mana and has 9 health. And 9 health is a lot for 6 mana. That's actually just a lot. Even when you're getting higher than 6 mana, 9 health is a lot. So this guy's pretty hard to kill. And the thing that really pushed me over the edge of thinking this card was good is, of course, the Paladin Death Knight seems really ridiculous with this. And it's really not that far-fetched to believe that this card would still be on the board when you go into your Death Knight turn. Because, like I said, this thing has 9 health, which is a lot of health. It also works well with Rag Lightlord. It can do some pretty silly things with Forbidden Healing, Chillblade Champion, True Silver Champion. So I just think this card is really strong. It even fights pretty well on its own. 3 attack is kinda low for 6 mana, but that health though. One issue with this card is once you start getting up to 6 mana, there's a lot of competition. You're gonna have Tyrion, your Death Knight, Ragnaros, Primordial Drake, Curator, Sunkeeper Tarim, Spikeridge Steed. So maybe Paladin just can't afford to play this card. But especially if you're playing the Paladin Death Knight, I think this is a really, really nice card to have in the deck. I like this card a lot. Bolvar Fireblood. So looking back on this card, I feel kind of dumb, because when I first saw it, I didn't realize that when Bolvar loses his Divine Shield, he actually buffs himself +2 attack. So I was thinking it's going to be kind of hard to orchestrate this so it ever really gets buffed. But actually, if it's not getting hexed or something, it gets buffed every time. So it's a 1/7 Divine Shield. When it loses its Divine Shield, it's a 3/7. That seems pretty solid, especially when you realize that this card comes down on 5. It's really hard to kill on turn 5. And then on turn 6, you have Spikeridge Steed, which is one of the most powerful things you can do on turn 6 in any class. And there's always the potential that you do just have a Righteous Protector hanging around with this guy. You have a Tyrion that gets popped later on, something like that. Even some slight synergy with Rallying Blade. I don't think there's ever going to be the Blood Knight Dream, at least not in a normal game. I'll probably try to do it. But hey, sometimes you can Blood Knight this guy and he gets up to like 13 power. And that's pretty sick, right? I think the card is just solid on its own though. And then any other Divine Shield synergy you have with it is just the cherry on top. So the Paladin Death Knight, possibly the best card in the set. I think it's very likely to be the best expensive card in the set. Something like Righteous Protector or that Druid 2-drop might end up being better than this, more metagame defining than this. Because let's face it, it's Hearthstone, it's always the cheap cards that matter, because a lot of times you're dead by turn 9. But if you're not dead by turn 9, this card is pretty damn good. The turn you play it, you get 5 armor, you get to kill something with your weapon, and you're going to heal for 5 off of that weapon. So the turn you play this, you're going to heal for 10 and kill something. And then on top of that, it upgrades your hero power. Instead of 1/1s, you summon 2/2s. But also, if they don't clear out your dudes, they eventually just win the game on their own, which is pretty fucking silly. Even if these things couldn't eventually just win the game for you, I think this card would be pretty good. Just that ridiculous weapon, the 5 armor and 2/2s instead of 1/1s. It is worth noting though that upgrading your hero power from 1/1s to 2/2s isn't necessarily that much of an upgrade in Paladin, because a lot of times you're using your hero power tokens to combo with equality. In that case, it doesn't really matter how many stats they have. You're comboing them with Sunkeeper Tarim, again, doesn't really matter too much what stats they have. Or if you're throwing like Blessing of Kings or Spikeridge Steed on them, it does matter, but not as much as just the raw stats of the buff spell being put on them. But then there's also the situations where you're not doing anything with your 1/1s, and now they're just 2/2s instead, so they actually like trade into things, and it's pretty dope. But then there's that whole if you have all 4, destroy the enemy hero clause. And I don't think that's going to be too relevant in most games. It is kind of a threat on its own, so your opponent isn't allowed to just let you hero power every turn. At a certain point they are going to have to kill them. And there's also the dream where you play Auctionmaster Beardo, hero power 4 times in the same turn and just win from nothing. I don't think that's very likely to happen too often, but the cost of putting an Auctionmaster Beardo and maybe a Burgly Bully in your Paladin deck is really not that high. They're pretty reasonable cards on their own, and even if you're not full comboing with Auctionmaster Beardo, it means your opponent has to be afraid of leaving 2 of your hero power guys up instead of 3 or something like that. Because even if you're not hero powering 4 times in the same turn, if you just catch somebody off guard with 2 hero powers in the same turn and that gives you all 4 and you win the game, that can be just a massive threat. And in certain matchups you just play Auctionmaster Beardo as a spider tank and you're not that upset by that. And I don't think Hydrologist is going anywhere in Paladin decks, so the secrets you get off that combo with your Beardo to give you more hero powers. So even if you're only winning like 15% of your games with a Beardo combo, I think just the threat of that Beardo combo is potentially worth including in the deck. But even without Beardo memes, even if you just remove the last sentence from the hero power, I think this card is still good, because a 5/3 lifesteal weapon on its own is probably worth like 7 or 8 mana. And then on top of that you get the armor, you get the upgraded hero power. Of all the classes in Hearthstone, Paladin has one of the easiest times actually getting to turn 9. It can survive with Tyrion and Rag Lightlord, it's got equality combos. You can even play Doomsayer in that deck to kind of lock down the board so you have a chance to play this guy. Damn, this card is good. So Paladin didn't get too much trash, they got a little bit of trash. But they also got probably the best Death Knight. Their regular legendary is pretty sick, they got a broken 1-drop. And maybe I'm being a little bit optimistic on Blackguard, but I think that card is really strong too. And they even got a pretty solid 2-mana spell that curves off of their broken 1-drop. So I think Paladin is pretty happy with this expansion.